Thank you.
Mr Chair, this bill is what it is. A razor that takes another slice at the public education system and another slice at what makes our tertiary institutions really effective and responsive to delivering community education, taking away the rights and opportunities of students, of staff and of the community to have a say in what's happening at their local tertiary institution. So it is what it is, a further razor to slice and dice the public education system in ways that aren't helpful. And I'm really concerned because I did listen to the response of the Minister, and she carefully went through the purposes of Educans that will take over the Teachers' Council. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, principals and teachers in all our communities are respected leaders, yet they can't lead their own profession. That's what the government is saying. They cannot be trusted to lead their own profession. Now, where's the sense in that? We let health professionals lead the health profession because the care of people is absolutely critical. Yet we can't let the teaching profession lead their organisation to ensure that the minds of the next generation can be shaped by people who absolutely know what they're doing. And in fact, I'm really concerned listening to the Minister's explanation for why independent people would be appointed to Educans, because it sounds to me like Educans will be running the teaching profession like a business. A bit like how they want to ensure that charter schools will be there to privatise the education system. Educans will be there to privatise the way in which the teaching profession operates. And we only need to go back to the comments about the difference between a code of conduct and the code of ethics. Well, the code of ethics is a lot like the health profession, where you lift up the standards of the profession to a degree where excellence is the threshold. A code of conduct is very transactional. It forces teaching into the mode where you do your job, and if you don't do these certain things and tick these certain boxes, well then, you know, you may not get your registration. Well then, that makes absolute sense when we consider the fact that the government has been pushing through national standards. And teachers throughout many schools are saying national standards don't prepare our children for the future of being innovative and creative learners. In fact, national standards forces young people to learn by rote learning. The bad old days when the teacher stands at the front of the classroom and just lectures to the kids. We have to pass tests, and that's the only way that you're assessing learning. Well, that is the past. We need an education system that prepares our young people for the future. We need to trust that our teachers are able to arbitrate over their own profession and set good ethical standards and be able to ensure that the profession can be the trusted profession that it always has been in New Zealand. This bill gets away from what I believe is core to what will be a successful public education system. I want to come back in particular to the provisions in the bill from sections 379 to 387 and make these particular comments. The current Teachers' Council has provision for advisory groups for Māori medium education and early childhood. Yet, the way in which the bill now reads, Educans will create these boards. There is no guarantee that those boards will make provision for Māori medium education or early childhood groups. That said, the important element of this is that we cannot get away from the things that have been successful. And it doesn't make any sense. So I would actually appreciate if the Minister responded to that to give some assurance, because it's not clear. She well knows that I wasn't a member on the Select Committee, so the question might be simple to answer, and I'd appreciate one. Also, many submissions, as I've read in the Select Committee records, show that the education profession themselves weren't very supportive of Educans, because they believed that that members needed to be freely elected, democratically elected by the profession. And that was such an important point that came through from a number of schools and submissions that went to the Select Committee. Obviously, the government didn't take on those particular recommendations. The other aspect that was commented on, which I think was well made, the point was well made by Chris Hipkins, our spokesperson, was on this issue of the Code of Ethics. Now, the Code of Ethics was actually developed by the teaching profession. And that's Mr. Chair? The Code of Ethics was developed by the teaching profession, and I'm speaking to Section 387, Mr. Chair. And that is such an important point because, again, these are trusted leaders of our community who know their profession, who many of whom have gone through an extensive qualification process. And in order to ensure that they can lift up the professional standard, then having a code of ethics is by far the best way to ensure that. In fact, we go and visit our schools and principals and teachers will say that the best thing about the New Zealand education system is actually the collegial nature within which we're able to share best practice and learning behaviours and actually build on those types of opportunities. And the code of ethics helps drive leadership. I'm really concerned that the Code of Conduct will reduce the way in which teachers are going to be assessed, which will build on the narrative that actually the government's move towards performance pay based on the Code of Conduct is something sounds a little bit not right. I'm also concerned that there is a feeling of mistrust in the way in which teachers are now beginning to feel within the schools. You certainly hear it on the ground. I'm sure members actually of the government will be well aware of that, and that they don't feel that they're any longer trusted by the government. And some of that may be relative to the discussion that we've had on the Code of Ethics. The other part that I'd like to comment on, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, is the limited authority to teach. Now, as they currently operate, as we all know, many LATs that exist within our schools are filling specific skill sets that are missing school by school. But this bill will change the way in which you recognise a skill set of an individual, and they will gain an authority to educate, and that will allow them to go anywhere. But the problem with that is that it's harder to assess where they can best fit. And I would still maintain that the limited authority to teach gives far greater autonomy to schools to be able to determine, unique to their community, to their demographic, to the skill set that they're able to attract into their community, to be able to have this type of approach and for that school, because then that will enable the granting of a registration for that purpose and for a period of time. But if you have these free roaming people with the authority to educate, it's much harder to get a grasp on where they're going and how whether in fact they're filling gaps. Now, the biggest concern that I have is relates to charter schools, and that's in Part 1.4a. And that's the fact, and we've debated it many times in this House, that charter schools can have non-registered teachers. And it seems to me that at a time when we need the profession to lift standards, to be able to ensure that they are in control of setting those standards, here we're saying on the one hand, with charter schools you can do whatever you want. As long as the contract between the Crown and the sponsor enable certain things to be met, who you get to teach, the quality of their ability to teach is actually something that sits very much within the terms of the contract and can't be assessed in the same way that we're expecting teachers within the public education system to be assessed. And I just think that that's wrong. This bill continues to act as a razor that slices and dices the public education system in a way that's not helpful. It continues to reinforce to the teaching profession that teachers and principals cannot be trusted and you cannot arbitrate over your own profession. And it continues to address issues that I think are not real to the challenges that communities face. Delivering education that is responsive to communities, the demographic, actually requires community voice. And we know how hard it is within schools to attract people onto the boards of trustees. Yet in your tertiary institution, when you're going for higher qualifications, the government is saying, well, we're going to take community voice out of it. We're not going to recognise the demographic that this tertiary institution is responding to. There's no need to have those types of views reflected at the strategic level to drive the delivery of tertiary education. So how are you going to retain the high numbers of people who aren't able to get there, and we need them to walk through the door and stay in tertiary education, if you don't have their voice reflected at the strategic governance level? I'm not sure. But I think if we peel away all the surface talk of the government, we will find some very challenging statistics for the government. It is harder and harder for tertiary institutions to attract people into their doors and let them go with a qualification.